Can you truly achieve awakening in Buddhism? What the mind can do. What is the mind? The mind isn't anything. Ajahn Chah. The mind is neither good nor evil, but it's what knows good and knows evil. It's what does good and does evil. And it's what lets go of good and lets go of evil. Ajahn Lee. A Brahmin once asked the Buddha, will all the world reach release, awakening, or half the world, or a third? But the Buddha didn't answer. Then, Ananda, concerned that the Brahmin might misconstrue the Buddha's silence, took the man aside and gave him an analogy. Imagine a fortress with a single gate. A wise gatekeeper would walk around the fortress and not see an opening in the wall big enough for even a cat to slip through. Because he's wise, he would realize that his knowledge didn't tell him how many people would come into the fortress, but it did tell him that whoever came into the fortress would have to come in through the gate. In the same way, the Buddha didn't focus on how many people would reach awakening, but he did know that anyone who reached awakening would have to follow the path he had found, abandoning the 5 hindrances, establishing the 4 frames of reference, and developing the 7 factors for awakening. What's striking about the Buddha's knowledge is the implied if. If people want to gain awakening, they will have to follow this path, but the choice as to whether they want awakening is theirs. The Buddha's knowledge of the future didn't mean that the future was preordained, for people are free to choose. They can take up a particular course of action and stick with it or not, as they see fit. The Buddha thus based all his teaching on freedom of choice. As he said, if everything were predetermined by the past, there would be no point in teaching a path to awakening. The number of people who would reach awakening would already have been set a long time ago, and they would have no need for a path or a teacher. Those preordained to awaken would get there inevitably as a result of a long past action or an essential nature already built into the mind. Those preordained not to awaken wouldn't stand a chance. But these things are not preordained. No one is doomed never to awaken, but until you've had your first sight of the deathless at stream entry, neither is awakening assured. It's contingent on intentional actions chosen in each present moment. And even after stream entry, you're constantly faced with choices that will speed up final awakening or slow it down. Nibbana, of course, is independent and unconditioned, but the act of awakening to Nibbana depends on a path of practice that has to be willed. It happens only if you choose to give rise to its causes. This, as the Buddha noted, involves determining to do 4 things: not to neglect discernment, to preserve truth, to develop relinquishment, and to train for peace. Chapter 1. Assumptions about the mind. To stick with these 4 determinations, the mind has to make some assumptions about itself, its power to do the necessary work, and to receive the anticipated benefits. But one of the central features of the Buddha's strategy as a teacher was that, even though his primary focus was on the mind, he nowhere defined what the mind is. As he said, if you define yourself, you limit yourself. So instead, he focused his assumptions on what the mind can do. To begin with, the mind can change quickly. Normally, a master of the apt simile, even the Buddha had to admit that he could find no adequate analogy for how quickly the mind can change. We might say that it can change in the twinkling of an eye, but it's actually faster than that. And it's capable of all sorts of things. Neither inherently good nor inherently bad, it can do a huge variety of good and bad actions. As the Buddha said, the mind is more variegated than the animal kingdom. Think of the many species of fish in the sea, birds in the sky, animals on the land and under the ground, whether extant or extinct. All of these species are products of minds, and the mind can take on a wider variety of forms than even that. This variety comes from the many different choices the mind makes under the influence of ignorance and defilement. But the mind doesn't always have to be defiled. Past karma is not entirely deterministic. Even though past karma shapes the range of options open to the mind in the present, it doesn't have to determine present karma. The intentions by which the mind chooses to fabricate actual experiences from among those options. Thus, present karma can choose to continue creating the conditions for more ignorance or not, because present choices are what keep ignorance alive. Although no one, not even a Buddha, can trace back to when the defilement of ignorance first began, the continued existence of ignorance depends on conditions continually provided by unskillful karma. If these conditions are removed, ignorance will disband. This is why the Buddha said that the mind is luminous, stained with defilements that come and go. Taken out of context, this statement might be construed as implying that the mind is inherently awakened. But in context, the Buddha is simply saying that the mind, once stained, is not permanently stained. When the conditions for the stains are gone, the mind becomes luminous again. But this luminosity is not an awakened nature. As the Buddha states, this luminous mind can be developed. In the scheme of the Four Noble Truths, if something is to be developed, it's not the goal. It's part of the path to the goal. After this, luminosity has been developed in the advanced stages of concentration. It's abandoned once it has completed its work in helping to pierce through ignorance. The fact that the mind's own choices can pierce its own ignorance underlies the Buddha's most important assumption about the mind. It can be trained to awaken, to see the causes of ignorance and to bring them to an end. The primary step in this training is the first determination, not to neglect discernment. This phrase may sound strange. To what extent do we consciously neglect discernment? But it points to an important truth. Discernment is insight into how the mind fabricates its experiences. This process of fabrication is going on all the time right before our eyes, even nearer than our eyes. And yet, part of the mind chooses to ignore it. We tend to be more interested in the experiences that result from the fabrication, the physical, mental, and emotional states we want to savor and enjoy. It's like watching a play. We enjoy entering into the make-believe world on the stage and prefer to ignore the noises made by the backstage crew that would call the reality of that world into question. This ignorance is willed, which is why we need an act of the will to see through it, to discern the backstage machinations of the mind. Discernment, thus, has two sides: understanding and motivation. You have to understand the mind's fabrications as fabrications, looking less for the what, that is, what they are, than for the how they happen as part of a causal process. And you have to be motivated to develop this discernment, to see why you want it to influence the mind. Otherwise, it won't have the conditions to grow. The understanding comes down to the basic insight of the Buddha's awakening, seeing things as actions and events in a pattern of cause and effect. It also involves seeing how some actions are unskillful, leading to stress and suffering, while others are skillful, bringing stress to an end, and that we have the freedom to choose skillful actions or not. This understanding, which forms the basic framework of the Four Noble Truths, is called appropriate attention. The motivation to develop appropriate attention grows from combining goodwill with this understanding. You set your sights on a happiness totally harmless. You see that if you make unskillful choices, you're going to cause suffering. If you make skillful ones, you won't. This motivation thus combines goodwill with heedfulness, the quality that underlies every step on the path. In fact, heedfulness lies at the root of all skillful qualities in the mind. Thus, in encouraging people to awaken, the Buddha never assumed that their awakening would come from the innate goodness of their nature. He simply assumed something very blatant and ordinary, that people like pleasure and hate pain, and that they care about whether they can gain that pleasure and avoid that pain. It was a mark of his genius that he could see the potential for awakening in this very common desire. Chapter 2. Building on Discernment. When you stick with the understanding and motivation provided by this first determination, it sets in motion the other three. For instance, the determination to preserve the truth grows from seeing the mind's capacity to lie to itself about whether its actions are causing suffering. You want to be honest and vigilant in looking for and admitting suffering, even when you're attached to the actions that cause it. This truthfulness relates to the path in two stages. First, when looking for unskillful actions that keep you off the path. And then, as the path nears fruition, looking for the subtle levels of stress caused even by skillful elements of the path, such as right concentration, once they have done their work and need to be let go for the sake of full liberation. The determination to develop relinquishment can then build on this truthful assessment of what needs to be done. Relinquishment requires discernment as well, for not only do you need to see what's skillful and what's not, you also need to keep reminding yourself that you have the freedom to choose and to be adept at talking yourself into doing skillful things you're afraid of and abandoning unskillful actions you like. The determination to train for peace helps maintain your sense of direction in this process, for it reminds you that the only true happiness is peace of mind, and that you want to look for ever-increasing levels of peace as they become possible through the practice. This determination emulates the trait that the Buddha said was essential to his awakening, the unwillingness to rest content with lesser levels of stillness when higher levels could be attained. In this way, the stages of concentration, instead of becoming obstacles or dangers on the path, serve as stepping stones to greater sensitivity, and through that sensitivity, to the ultimate peace where all passion, aversion, and delusion grow still. This peace thus grows from the simple choice to keep looking at the mind's fabrications as processes, as actions and results. But to fully achieve this peace, your discernment has to be directed not only at the mind's fabrication of the objects of its awareness, but also at its fabrications about itself and about the path it's creating. Your sense of who you are is a fabrication, regardless of whether you see the mind as separate or interconnected, finite or infinite, good or bad. The path is also a fabrication, very subtle and sometimes seemingly effortless, but fabricated nonetheless. If these layers of inner fabrication aren't seen for what they are, if you regard them as innate or inevitable, they can't be deconstructed, and full awakening can't occur. No innate nature. This is why the Buddha never advocated attributing an innate nature of any kind to the mind, good, bad, or Buddha. The idea of innate nature slipped into the Buddhist tradition in later centuries, when the principle of freedom was forgotten. Past bad karma was seen as so totally deterministic that there seemed no way around it unless you assumed either an innate Buddha in the mind that could overpower it, or an external Buddha who would save you from it. But when you understand the principle of freedom, that past karma doesn't totally shape the present, and that present karma can always be free to choose the skillful alternative, you realize that the idea of innate natures is unnecessary, excess baggage on the path, and it bogs you down. If you assume that the mind is basically bad, you won't feel capable of following the path and will tend to look for outside help to do the work for you. If you assume that the mind is basically good, you'll feel capable but will easily get complacent. This stands in the way of the heedfulness needed to get you on the path, and to keep you there when the path creates states of relative peace and ease that seem so trustworthy and real. If you assume a Buddha nature, you not only risk complacency, but you also entangle yourself in metaphysical thorn patches. If something with an awakened nature can suffer, what good is it? How could something innately awakened become defiled? If your original Buddha nature became diluted, what's to prevent it from becoming diluted after it's reawakened? These points become especially important as you reach the subtle levels of fabrication on the more advanced stages of the path. If you're primed to look for innate natures, you'll tend to see innate natures, especially when you reach the luminous, non-dual stages of concentration called themeless, emptiness, and undirected. You'll get stuck on whichever stage matches your assumptions about what your awakened nature is. But if you're primed to look for the process of fabrication, you'll see these stages as forms of fabrication, and this will enable you to deconstruct them, to pacify them, until you encounter the peace that's not fabricated at all. Exploring freedom. So instead of making assumptions about innate natures or inevitable outcomes, the Buddha advised exploring the possibility of freedom as it's immediately present each time you make a choice. Freedom is not a nature, and you don't find it by looking for your hidden innate nature. You find freedom by looking at where it's constantly showing itself, in the fact that your present intentions are not totally conditioned by the past. You catch your first glimmer of it as a range of possibilities from which you can choose, and as your ability to act more skillfully, causing more pleasure and less pain than you ordinarily might. Your sense of this freedom grows as you explore and exercise it, each time you choose the most skillful course of action heading in the direction of discernment, truthfulness, relinquishment, and peace. The choice to keep making skillful choices may require assumptions, but to keep the mind focused on the issue of fabrication, the Buddha saw that these assumptions are best kept to a bare minimum, that the mind wants happiness, that it can choose courses of actions that promote happiness or thwart it, that it can change its ways, and that it can train itself to achieve the ultimate happiness where all fabrications fall away. These assumptions are the Buddha's starter kit of skillful means to get you on the path of goodwill, heedfulness, and appropriate attention. As with any journey, you do best to take along only the bare essentials so that you don't weigh yourself down. This is especially true as you test the limits of freedom, for the closer you come to ultimate freedom, the more you find that things fall away. First, the nouns of natures and identities fall away as you focus on the verbs of action and choice. Then the verbs fall away too. When the Buddha was asked who or what he was, he didn't answer with a who or what. He said simply, awakened, a past participle, a verb that has done its work. Similarly, when the suttas describe the awakening of an arahant, they say that his or her mind is released from fermentations. But when they describe how this release is experienced, they simply say, with release, there is the knowledge, released. No comment on what is released. Not even, as it's sometimes translated, it is released. There's no noun, no pronoun, just a past participle. Released. That's all, but it's enough. Chapter 3. Faith in Awakening. The Buddha never placed unconditional demands on anyone's faith, and for anyone from a culture where the dominant religions do place such demands on one's faith, this is one of Buddhism's most attractive features. We read his famous instructions to the Kalamas, in which he advises testing things for oneself, and we see it as an invitation to believe or not whatever we like. Some people go so far as to say that faith has no place in the Buddhist tradition, that the proper Buddhist attitude is one of skepticism. But even though the Buddha recommends tolerance and a healthy skepticism toward matters of faith, he also makes a conditional request about faith. If you sincerely want to put an end to suffering, that's the condition. You should take certain things on faith, as working hypotheses, and then test them through following his path of practice. There's a hint of this need for faith even in the discourse to the Kalamas. Don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these mental qualities are skillful, these mental qualities are blameless, these mental qualities are praised by the wise, these mental qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to welfare and to happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. And 3.65. The first few phrases in this passage, refuting the authority of Scripture and tradition, are so strikingly empirical that it's easy to miss the phrase buried further on, asserting that you have to take into account what's praised by the wise. That phrase is important, for it helps to make sense of the Buddha's teachings as a whole. If he had simply wanted you to trust your own unaided sense of right and wrong, why would he have left so many other teachings? So the Buddha's advice to the Kalamas is balanced. Just as you shouldn't give unreserved trust to outside authority, you can't give unreserved trust to your own logic and feelings if they go against the genuine wisdom of others. As other early discourses make clear, wise people can be recognized by their words and behavior, but the standards for wisdom are clearly measured against the Buddha and his noble disciples, people who've already touched awakening. And the proper attitude toward those who meet these standards is faith. Faith, empiricism, and awakening. For a disciple who has conviction in the teacher's message and lives to penetrate it, what accords with the Dhamma is this: the Blessed One is the teacher, I am a disciple. He is the one who knows, not I. For a disciple who has conviction in the teacher's message and lives to penetrate it, what accords with the Dhamma is this: gladly would I let the flesh and blood in my body dry up, leaving just the skin, tendons, and bones. But if I have not attained what can be reached through human firmness, human persistence, human striving, there will be no relaxing my persistence. MN 70. Repeatedly, the Buddha stated that faith in a teacher is what leads you to learn from that teacher. Faith in the Buddha's own awakening is a requisite strength for anyone else who wants to attain awakening. As it fosters persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment, this faith can take you all the way to the deathless. So there's a tension in the Buddha's recommendations about faith and empiricism. I've discussed this point with many Asian Buddhists, and few of them find the tension uncomfortable. But Western Buddhists, raised in a culture where religion and faith have long been at war with science and empiricism, find the tension very disconcerting. In discussing the issue with them over the past several years, I've noticed that they often try to resolve it in the same ways that, historically, the tension between Christian faith and scientific empiricism has been resolved in our own culture. Three general positions stand out, not only because they are the most common, but also because they are so clearly Western. Consciously or not, they attempt to understand the Buddha's position on faith and empiricism in a way that can be easily mapped onto the modern Western battle lines between religion and science. The first interpretation has its roots in the side of Western culture that totally rejects the legitimacy of faith. In this view, the Buddha was an embodiment of the Victorian ideal of the heroic agnostic, one who eschewed the childish consolations of faith and instead advocated a purely scientific method for training and strengthening one's own mind. Because his method focused entirely on the present moment, questions of past and future were totally irrelevant to his message. Thus, any references to faith in such issues as past karma, future rebirth, or an unconditioned happiness separate from the immediate input of the senses are later interpolations in the text, which Buddhist agnostics, following the Buddha's example, should do their best to reject. The second interpretation has roots in the side of Western culture that has rejected either the specifics of Christian faith or the authority of any organized religion, but has appreciated the emotion of faith as an essential requirement for mental health. This view presents the Buddha as a romantic hero who appreciated the subjective value of faith in establishing a sense of wholeness within and interconnectedness without. Tolerant and opposed to dogmatism, he saw the psychological fact of a living faith as more important than its object. In other words, it doesn't matter where faith is directed, as long as it's deeply felt and personally nourishing. Faith in the Buddha's awakening means simply believing that he found what worked for himself. This carries no implications for what will work for you. If you find the teaching on karma and rebirth comforting, fine, believe it. If not, don't. If you want to include an all-powerful god or a goddess in your worldview, the Buddha wouldn't object. What's important is that you relate to your faith in a way that's emotionally healing, nourishing, and empowering. Because this second interpretation tends to be all-embracing, it sometimes leads to a third one that encompasses the first two. This interpretation presents the Buddha as trapped in his historical situation. Much like us, he was faced with the issue of finding a meaningful life in light of the worldview of his day. His views on karma and rebirth were simply assumptions picked up from the crude science of ancient India, while his path of practice was an attempt to negotiate a satisfying life within those assumptions. If he were alive today, he would try to reconcile his values with the discoveries of modern science, in the same way that some Westerners have done with their faith in monotheism. The underlying assumption of this position is that science is concerned with facts, religion with values. Science provides the hard data to which religion should provide meaning. Thus, each Buddhist would be performing the work of a Buddha by accepting the hard facts that have been scientifically proven for our generation, and then searching the Buddhist tradition, as well as other traditions, where appropriate, for myths and values to give meaning to those facts, and in the process forging a new Buddhism for our times. Each of these three interpretations may make eminent sense from a Western point of view, but none of them do justice to what we know of the Buddha or of his teaching on the role of faith and empiricism on the path. All three are correct in emphasizing the Buddha's unwillingness to force his teachings on other people, but by forcing our own assumptions onto his teachings and actions, they misread what that unwillingness means. He wasn't an agnostic. He had strong reasons for declaring some ideas as worthy of faith and others as not. And his teachings on karma, rebirth, and nirvana broke radically with the dominant worldview of his time. He was neither a Victorian nor a romantic hero, nor was he a victim of his times. He was a hero who, among other things, mastered the issue of faith and empiricism in his own way. But to appreciate that way, we first have to step back from the Western cultural battlefield and look at faith and empiricism in a more basic context, simply as processes within the individual mind. There, they play their major roles in the psychology of how we decide to act. Although we like to think that we base our decisions on hard facts, we actually use both faith and empiricism in every decision we make. Even in our most empirically based decisions, our vision is hampered by our position in time. As Kierkegaard noted, we live forwards but understand backwards. Any hard-headed business entrepreneur will tell you that the future has to be taken on faith, no matter how much we know of the past. What's more, We're often forced into decisions where there's no time or opportunity to gather enough past facts for an informed choice. At other times, we have too many facts, as when a doctor is faced with many conflicting tests on a patient's condition, and we have to go on faith in deciding which facts to focus on and which ones to ignore. However, faith also plays a deeper role in many of our decisions. As William James once observed, there are two kinds of truths in life: those whose validity has nothing to do with our actions, and those whose reality depends on what we do. Truths of the first sort, truths of the observer, include facts about the behavior of the physical world, how atoms form molecules, how stars explode. Truths of the second sort, truths of the will, include skills, relationships, business ventures, anything that requires your effort to make it real. With truths of the observer, it's best to stay skeptical until reasonable evidence is in. With truths of the will, though, the truth won't happen without your faith in it, often in the face of unpromising odds. If you don't believe that democracy will work in your nation, it won't. If you don't believe that becoming a pianist is worthwhile, or that you have the makings of a good pianist, it won't happen. Truths of the will are the ones most relevant to our pursuit of true happiness. Many of the most inspiring stories in life are of people who create truths of this sort when a mountain of empirical evidence is against them. In cases like this, the truth requires that faith actively discount the immediate facts. If we dig even deeper into the psychology of decision-making, we run into an area for which no scientific evidence can offer any proof. Do we actually act, or are actions an illusion? Are our acts already predetermined by physical laws or an external intelligence, or do we have free will? Are the results of our acts illusory? Are causal relationships real or only a fiction? Even the most carefully planned scientific experiment could never settle any of these issues. And yet, once we become aware of them, we have to take a stand on them if we want to continue putting any energy into our thoughts, words, and deeds. These were the areas where the Buddha focused his teachings on empiricism and faith. Although his first noble truth requires that we observe suffering until we comprehend it, we have to take on faith his assertion that the facts we observe about suffering are the most important guide for making decisions, moment by moment, throughout life. Because his third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, is a truth of the will, we have to take it on faith that it's a possible goal, a worthwhile goal, and that we're capable of attaining it. And because the fourth noble truth, the path to the cessation of suffering, is a path of action and skill, we have to take it on faith that our actions are real, that we have free will, and yet that there's a causal pattern to the workings of the mind from which we can learn in mastering that skill. As the Buddha said, the path will lead to a direct experience of these truths, but only if you bring faith to the practice will you know this for yourself. In other words, faith in the Buddhist context means faith in the ability of your actions to lead to a direct experience of the end of suffering. Chapter 4. Why People Search and What They're Searching For. The Buddha offered these teachings to people seeking advice on how to find true happiness. That's why he was able to avoid any coercion of others. His teachings assumed that his listeners were already involved in a search. When we understand his views on what it means to search, why people search, and what they're searching for, we can understand his advice on how to use faith and empiricism in a successful search. The best way to do this is to examine 5 of his similes, illustrating how a search should be conducted. The first simile illustrates search in its most raw and unfocused form. 2 strong men have grabbed another man by the arms and are dragging him to a pit of burning embers. The Buddha notes, "Wouldn't the man twist his body this way and that?" The twisting of his body stands for the way we react to suffering. We don't bother to ask if our suffering is predetermined or our actions have any hope of success. We simply put up a struggle and do what we can to escape. It's our natural reaction. The Buddha taught that this reaction is twofold. We're bewildered. Why is this happening to me? And we search for a way to put an end to the suffering. When he stated that all he taught was suffering and the end of suffering, he was responding to these two reactions, providing an explanation of suffering and its end so as to do away with our bewilderment, at the same time showing the way to the end of suffering as a way of satisfying our search. He had no use for the idea, often advanced by later writers in the Buddhist tradition, that our suffering comes from our struggle to resist suffering, that the search for an end to suffering is precisely what keeps us from seeing the peace already there. In the light of the above simile, simply relaxing into a total acceptance of the moment means relaxing into the prospect of being burned alive. The present keeps morphing into the future, and you can't turn a blind eye to where it's taking you. This simile also explains why the idea of a Buddhism without faith holds little appeal for people suffering from serious illness, oppression, poverty, or racism. Their experience has shown that the only way to overcome these obstacles is to pursue truths of the will, which require faith as their rock-solid foundation. The second simile. A man searching for fruit climbs a tree to eat his fill and to stuff his garments with fruit to take home. While he is there, another man searching for fruit comes along. The second man can't climb the tree, but he has an axe, so he chops the tree down. If the first man doesn't quickly get out of the tree, he may break an arm or a leg or even die. This simile shows the perils of looking for true happiness in the wrong place, in sensual pleasures. If your happiness depends on anything other people can take away from you, you're putting yourself in danger. As the Buddha notes, we hope for happiness in sensual pleasures, not because they've ever really satisfied us, but because we can't imagine any other escape from pain and suffering. If we allowed ourselves to believe that there is another alternative, we'd be more willing to question our strong faith in our cravings and attachments, more willing to look for that alternative and give it a try. And, as the third simile argues, if we look in the right way, we'll find it. A person searching for milk tries to get milk out of a cow by twisting its horn. Another person searching for milk tries to get milk out of the cow by pulling at its udder. The Buddha taught this simile in response to an assertion that there is nothing a human being can do to attain release from suffering. We can attain it, he said, as long as we follow the right method, like the person pulling at the udder of the cow. The right method starts with right understanding, and this is where faith in the Buddha's awakening comes in. As the Buddha once stated, he didn't tell us everything he awakened to. What he told was like a handful of leaves. What he learned was like the leaves in the forest. Still, the leaves in the handful contained all the lessons that would help others to awaken. Right understanding begins with learning what those specific lessons are. The most important lesson and the most important item of faith is simply the fact of the awakening itself. The Buddha achieved it through his own efforts, and he did so not because he was more than human, but because he developed mental qualities that we each have the potential to develop. To have faith in his awakening thus means having faith in your own potential for awakening. However, the specifics of what he learned in his awakening are important as well. It's not simply the case that he found what worked for him, while what works for you may be something else entirely. No matter how much you twist a cow's horn, it'll never produce milk. The Buddha's insights penetrated into how things work, what it means for them to work. These insights apply to everyone throughout time. When summarizing his awakening in the most condensed form, the Buddha focused on a principle of causality that explains how we live in a world where patterns of causality fashion events, and yet those events are not totally predetermined by the past. The principle is actually a dual one, for there are two kinds of causality interweaving in our lives. The first is that of a cause giving results in the immediate present. When this is, that is. When this isn't, that isn't. When you turn on a stereo, for example, the noise comes out. When you turn it off, the noise stops. The second type of causality is that of a cause giving results over time. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. If you study now, you'll have knowledge long into the future. If you damage your brain, the negative effects will be long-term as well. Applied to karma or intention, the dual principle means this. Any moment of experience consists of three things. 1. Pleasures and pains resulting from past intentions. 2. Present intentions. And 3. Pleasures and pains resulting from present intentions. Thus, the present is not totally shaped by the past. In fact, the most important element shaping your present experience of pleasure or pain is how you fashion, with your present intentions, the raw material provided by past intentions, and your present intentions can be totally free. This is how there's free will in the midst of causality. At the same time, the pattern in the way intentions lead to results allows us to learn from past mistakes. This freedom within a pattern opens the way to a path of mental training that can lead to the end of suffering. We practice generosity, virtue, and meditation to learn the power of our intentions and, in particular, to see what happens as our intentions grow more skillful, so skillful that present intentions actually stop. Only when they stop can you prove for yourself how powerful they've been. And the spot where they stop is where the unconditioned, the end of suffering, is found. From there, you can return to intentions, but you're no longer their captive or slave. In presenting his teachings on karma and suffering to his listeners, the Buddha would offer empirical evidence to corroborate them, noting, for instance, how your reaction to another person's misery depends on how attached you are to that person. But he never attempted to back these teachings with full-scale empirical proof. In fact, he heaped ridicule on his contemporaries, the Jains, who attempted to prove their more deterministic teaching on karma by claiming that all those who kill, steal, lie, or engage in illicit sex will suffer from their actions here and now. Haven't you seen the case, the Buddha asked, where a man is rewarded by a king for killing the king's enemy, for stealing from the king's enemy, for amusing the king with a clever lie, for seducing the king's enemy's wife? Even though the basic principle of karma is simple enough, skillful intentions lead to pleasure, unskillful intentions to pain. The dual principle of causality through which karma operates is so complex, like a Mandelbrot set, that you would go crazy trying to nail the whole thing down empirically. So instead of an empirical proof for his teaching on karma, the Buddha offered a pragmatic proof. If you believe in his teachings on causality, karma, rebirth, and the Four Noble Truths, how will you act? What kind of life will you lead? Won't you tend to be more responsible and compassionate? If, on the other hand, you were to believe in any of the alternatives, such as a doctrine of an impersonal fate or a deity who determined the course of your pleasure and pain, or a doctrine that all things were coincidental and without cause, what would those beliefs lead you to do? Would they allow you to put an end to suffering through your own efforts? Would they allow any purpose for knowledge at all? If, on the other hand, you refuse to commit to a coherent idea of what human action can do, would you be likely to see a demanding path of practice all the way through to the end? This was the kind of reasoning that the Buddha used to inspire faith in his awakening and in its relevance to our own search for true happiness. The fourth simile. The fourth simile stresses the importance of not settling for anything less than the genuine thing. A man searching for heartwood goes into a forest and comes to a tree containing heartwood, but instead of taking the heartwood, he takes home some sapwood, branches, or bark. Faith in the possibility of nirvana, the heartwood of the path, is what keeps you from getting waylaid by the pleasures of the sapwood and bark. The gratification that comes from being generous and virtuous, the sense of peace, interconnectedness, and oneness that comes with strong concentration. Yet, surprisingly, modern discussions of the role of faith in the Buddha's teachings rarely mention this point and focus on faith in karma and rebirth instead. This is surprising because nirvana is much less related to our everyday experience than either karma or rebirth. We see the fruits of our actions all around us. We see people being born with distinct personalities and differing strengths, and it's only a short leap to the idea that there's some connection between these things. Nirvana, however, isn't connected to anything we've experienced at all. It's already there, but hidden by all our desires for physical and mental activity. To touch it, we have to abandon our habitual attachment to activity. To believe that such a thing is possible and that it's the ultimate happiness is to take a major leap. Many in the Buddha's time were willing to take the leap, while many others were not, preferring to content themselves with the branches and sapwood, wanting simply to learn how to live happily with their families in this life and go to heaven in the next. Nirvana, they said, could wait. Faced with this honest and gentle resistance to his teaching on nirvana, the Buddha was happy to comply. But he was less tolerant of the stronger resistance he received from Brahmas, heavenly deities who complacently felt that their experience of limitless oneness and compassion in the midst of samsara, their sapwood, was superior to the heartwood of nirvana. In cases like this, he used all the psychic and intellectual powers at his disposal to humble their pride, because he realized that their views totally closed the door to awakening. If you think that your sapwood is actually heartwood, you won't look for anything better. When your sapwood breaks, you'll decide that heartwood is a lie. But if you realize that you're using bark and sapwood, you leave open the possibility that someday you'll go back and give the heartwood a try. Of course, it's even better if you can take the Buddha's teachings on nirvana as a direct challenge in this lifetime, as if he were saying, "Here's your chance. Can you prove me wrong?" The fifth simile. An experienced elephant hunter, searching for a big bull elephant, comes across a large elephant footprint in the forest. However, he doesn't jump to the conclusion that it's the footprint of a big bull elephant. Why? Because there are dwarf female elephants with big feet. It might be one of theirs. He follows along and sees some scratch marks and tusk marks high up on the trees, but still doesn't jump to the conclusion that he's on the trail of a big bull elephant. Why? Because there are tall female elephants with tusks. The marks might be theirs. He follows along and finally sees a big bull elephant under a tree or in a clearing. That's when he concludes that he's found his bull elephant. In explaining this simile, the Buddha said that all the preliminary steps of the practice, going into the wilderness as a monastic, adhering to the precepts, developing restraint, contentment, and strong concentration, seeing past lives and gaining vision of the beings of the cosmos dying and being reborn in line with their karma, are simply footprints and scratch marks of the Buddha's awakening. Only when you have your own first taste of awakening, having followed his path, do you really know that your faith in his awakening was well placed. Touching the dimension where suffering ends, you realize that the Buddha's teachings about it were not only true but also useful. He knew what he was talking about and was able to point you there as well. What's interesting about this simile is the way it combines healthy faith with honest skepticism. To act on this faith is to test it, the way you test a working hypothesis. You need faith to keep following the footprints, but you also need the honesty to recognize where faith ends and knowledge begins. This is why, in the Buddhist context, faith and empiricism are inseparable. Unlike a monotheistic religion, where faith centers on the power of another, faith in the Buddha's awakening keeps pointing back to the power of your own actions. Do you have enough power over your intentions to make them harmless? Do harmless intentions then give you the freedom to drop intention entirely? The only way you can answer these questions is by being scrupulously honest about your intentions, to detect even the slightest traces of harm, even the slightest movement of intention itself. Only then will you know the deathless, totally unconditioned by intention for sure. But if you claim to know things that you don't, how can you trust yourself to detect any of these things? You need to make your honesty worthy of your faith, testing its assumptions until you find true knowledge in the test. This is why science will never be able to pass valid judgment on the truths of awakening, for the path deals in matters that outside experimenters can't reach. Although others may sympathize with your suffering, the suffering itself is an experience you can share with no one else. The honesty and skillfulness of your intentions is an affair of your internal dialogue, something that is also purely your own. Scientists can measure the neurological data indicating pain or intentional activity, but there's no external measurement for how the pain feels or how honest your intentional dialogue may be. And as for the deathless, it has no physical correlates at all. The closest that outside empirical measurement can get is to pictures of the footprints on the ground and the marks in the trees. To get to the bull elephant, you have to do what the Buddha's disciple Sariputta did. He kept following the path without jumping to dishonest conclusions until he saw the elephant within. Then, when the Buddha asked him, "Do you take it on faith that these 5 strengths, faith, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment, lead to the deathless?" Sariputta could answer honestly, "No, I don't take it on faith, I know." As Sariputta stated in another discourse, his proof was experiential but so inward that it touched a dimension where not only the external senses, but even the sense of the functioning of the mind can't reach. If you want to confirm his knowledge, you have to touch that dimension in the only place you can access it, inside yourself. This is one of 2 ways in which the Buddha's method differs from that of modern empiricism. The other has to do with the integrity of the person attempting the proof. As in science, faith in the Buddha's awakening acts like a working hypothesis, but the test of that hypothesis requires an honesty deeper and more radical than anything science requires. You have to commit yourself, every variation on who you feel you are, totally to the test. Only when you take apart all clinging to your inner and outer senses can you prove whether the activity of clinging is what hides the deathless. The Buddha never forced anyone to commit to this test, both because you can't coerce people to be honest with themselves, and because he saw that the pit of burning embers was coercion enough.